I want to have everyone help me welcome Lori Apple from Zalando to the stage. She's going to be giving a talk entitled, "We Need to Talk, How Communication Helps Code." Please welcome Lori.
Hi, thanks for coming. This is a really super highly technical talk about communication, talk technology. So I want to help you achieve, by the end of this talk, some ideas that will help you get to these famous logos, these household names, these technologies that we love. And avoid this, the big old dumpster fire of projects that fail, projects that we don't understand, that we made 6 months ago, and that no one uses, and that make us sad. How many of you have worked on such a project like this in the audience? All right. And how many of you have made a dumpster fire? Yay. Why not? All right. So just to cover what I'll be talking about, I'll just do a little communication overview, some basic concepts about how we communicate, why we don't. And then I'll cover establishing a dialogue with the audience that you have, your potential users, and if you're in the open source community, your potential contributors. And even if you're in an internal open source community inside your own company, I'll talk about some of those techniques as well, specifically InnerSource, but also user research and documentation. Communicating with your code itself. I'll give you 2 examples from Zalando, one that's great, one that's not so great. And then finally, just some tips to help you keep communicating once you publish something on GitHub or once you create something for your company so that you can keep the momentum going in helping your project grow and develop and stay alive. So just a few quick slides about where I come from. I come from the land of Zalando. It's a gigantic e-commerce company. It's a European online fashion platform. We do business in 15 countries. And here are some statistics to show how big we are. Lots of people, lots of money, lots of things that we sell, essentially clothing and shoes. Our open source profile is mostly concentrated here. This is a dashboard. This is just a screenshot of it. So if you go to this URL, you can find most of our most useful projects. We also have a separate GitHub organization, Zalando-incubator, for brand new projects that are developing, coming online, and we're testing them out. And there you'll find some great Kubernetes projects. So different tools, if you're using Kubernetes, go check those out at the Zalando-incubator. About me, I have a couple of jobs. So I'm an agile coach and project manager inside our core search dev team. I'm also the open source evangelist for the whole tech team of 1,800 people. I participate in Red Hat's ambassadors program for open organizations, driving open organizational values like transparency, collaboration, inclusivity. And I'm the co-chair of SRECon, the Site Reliability Engineering Conference in the EMEA version. So if you're interested in speaking at that conference next year, talk to me. My Twitter handle is that. So let's get into communication, why we should talk and why we often don't. So talking and communicating is really a software skill. Some people call it a soft skill, but I think it was Seth Godin who said, soft skills are actually some of the hardest skills that we can develop. And empathy is a quality of our communication that can often make the difference between effective and successful communication and communication fails. So empathy is not an emotion, it's actually a skill. And Andrea Goulet, who's one of my favorite thought leaders, talks about this a lot in her presentations. And she defines it as empathy is something that you develop by listening and understanding your audience, and then you apply it by taking perspective. So listening and observing and connecting with people actually helps you shape a perspective that is fact-based, that can then help you provide responses, communication in return, that will make your conversation partner, your audience feel comfortable, feel understood, helps you drive collaboration with them. So those are the benefits. Chad Fowler, who's another great thought leader, he has written several blog posts about empathy as a really important business tool or getting things done because it helps you to motivate people, it helps you inspire them, and it also helps you engage them. So engaging software teams to deliver something on time. It really can be the difference between a motivated team and a demotivated team. And it doesn't matter what your personality profile is. Everybody can have empathy, and everybody can be a effective communicator. So even if you're introverted and you don't really enjoy crowds or interacting with lots of people, or you don't like public speaking, you can still be an effective communicator. Maybe you will write something instead of giving a talk. Maybe you will speak in a smaller group instead of a larger one. This is all amounts to skills that we can develop over time. There's very few born amazing communicators. This is a practice. Despite that, we often don't try it out. We often don't work on our communication skills, and we don't talk to each other. And there's different reasons for this. Maybe we're afraid that we'll just be really bad at it, that we're awkward or we're shy, and we just say to ourselves, we're not going to do this well, so we might as well not. There's also reasons of time, not having time to communicate at length or communicate so well or prioritize it. Sometimes different priorities prevent us from having the time to communicate, the priorities that are set upon us by our managers or our teams. Sometimes we just don't like to. There's certain types of communication that we might avoid, like public speaking. And sometimes we try to communicate, but the why and the context of our message is maybe not so clear, so that our audience doesn't really understand what the message is. Sometimes writing things down can help us communicate more effectively, yet we don't do it in the software context. So earlier this year, GitHub put out the results of their open source survey, and that was about 5,500 respondents. 93% of the respondents said that incomplete and outdated docs were a problem that was affecting their ability to deliver. So a lot of us are not writing the docs. 60% of those respondents said that even though they had seen problems, they hadn't taken a measure to fix and remedy the documentation problems that they solve. And here's some great people on Twitter that you can follow, from Victor Klang from Lightbend, Joe Armstrong, one of the co-founders of Erlang. We love when people do write documentation, but we often don't help them along. And again, this might be because we're afraid that we're bad writers. We might have writer's block. We might not know if what we have to say is important. So oftentimes, the difference between us being comfortable communicating and not being comfortable is our context. So again, any of us in the right context can be amazing communicators in our own way. So these kinds of values can make communicating with each other more possible and simpler and a lot less scary. So these 5 values are actually combined together in the open source.com's an open organization program's maturity model. So this set of 5 values is actually a set that in the work that I'm doing with the open organization ambassadors with Red Hat and opensource.com, we've identified as enabling communication to really be much simpler and less friction-free than in organizations where these values are missing. So transparency makes sure that we have the right information so that we can communicate effectively. Inclusivity means that everybody can communicate regardless of their style, their abilities, that they still are comfortable and feeling like they can express themselves. Adaptability means that we communicate to bring new people into our projects and teams, and so they feel welcome and comfortable. Collaboration is the art of communicating on work and projects and getting things done. And community is another subset of that, or another aspect of that, because when we communicate effectively, we start to build a small system or a culture of people that are united behind the same goal, or that feel the same level of comfort and trust among each other. And talking and empathy are really key in making these values happen, and these values in turn are often key in making the talking happen. You can find this maturity model at that link. When we have these kinds of open values in our context and they're our environment for working, then it's a lot simpler to establish a dialogue, and it might even come naturally to us. It might actually even become our habit, as much as we may not always have most time that we would like or enjoy it the most. So let's pivot now to 3 ways that all of us can actually communicate through our work to it's kind of like talking through our work. User research, documentation, and InnerSource. So user research is when we want to build something new and we don't know what to build and we don't know if it will actually resonate with a given audience. We talk to potential users, and those could be our peers, those could be actual customers buying our services. That if you're like an e-commerce company, so it'd be the people buying the shoes or the clothes or the other things. We talk to those potential users and we listen and we collect data from them to then inform our development. And this is extremely useful because these kinds of dialogues will challenge our own biases. We're talking to people whose reality is different or slightly different enough from ours so that we can actually test our hypotheses before we start writing code or setting out to create a very ambitious project that may not actually take on because no one besides us needs it. So there's different ways that you can do this and different levels of interaction. You can do games and brainstorming sessions. Have a team of people that love to be creative, sit together and work out what this project should look like. You can have a focus group where you actually have a bunch of people and you ask them questions, about how their experience was, what they're looking for, these kinds of questions to collect the data to inform your development process. Doing a survey, so Google Forms is really easy. Just send out a survey and collect data that way. This is often pretty impersonal, and it might not get you the amount of data that you need, like facial gestures and expressions that people might make that will give you a lot of insight into how they're actually feeling and what kind of message they are expecting from you and from your project. In a survey, you can't really capture that so well. And finally, my favorite one, the one-on-one interview, where you actually just sit down with the person and talk to them and ask them questions. Should this project exist? Would you use it? What would you like it to do? These kinds of questions. So then they become your partner, and this dialogue can form into a project vision that you can actually implement. Be open to surprises if you try these techniques out. This is really most effective when we set aside our own biases and our own opinions and our dreams and put them to the test with other people and other users. So just be open to that information that you get. And obviously, you're the editor in the end. You can decide whether to take that insight or not. But understand maybe the motivations, your own motivations for why you would set aside some feedback and not others. Just try to treat it all the same. When you do this kind of user research, you can often come up with a persona, a user persona, and that can be your team down the hall, who's the primary user, so a member of that team, an internal team that might use your service. That can be the actual customer spending money on your product. That could be lots of different user personas. That's up for you to decide. But what you want to do is take this user research and actually craft a fake person. So, this is a cat, and if you can actually build software for cats that they use, that is next level amazing. But here, we have Jen Meow Meow, the fictitious cat developer, and we actually give her an age, we give her hobbies, we give her realities. So when Jen is at work, she's under pressure. Maybe she's on call all the time. And at the middle of the night, she doesn't want the service to be causing her to spend the rest of her night trying to fix it. So, what is Jen's reality? And how can we build a product or a project that speaks to that reality? And how do we make sure that we remain in touch with her reality going down the line? So, checking in with Jen in the future and seeing how is it going? And if she's getting a lot of calls in the middle of the night, well, maybe we need to talk to Jen and fix her problem. So this is very useful. My team is a software as a service team. We build stuff for other teams inside our search department. And we have user personas to serve specific needs from our specific colleagues. When you have a project, then you have something to document. But you don't always have to have the project yet before you start documenting. The idea behind writing documentation is that you can actually scope out your vision and sketch it so that others can provide feedback, and you also don't have to repeat yourself a lot of times. So there's this kind of stereotype that developers hate writing docs. I really don't like that because I know a lot of developers who love to write docs, or developers that will write docs if you help them along. So if you're a manager or working in product, like, don't set that expectation out that your development team hates writing docs, because then you're planting the seed of, well, I guess I should hate docs. I guess I don't have to do docs. I guess it's not part of my job. And that's not the right message that you want to send if you want to really drive communication. So there's different ways to document successfully when you're starting a new project. And you can also do these as you develop the project and it becomes older over time. So one of the mantras around this is working backwards with words. So start with an idea, which you can jot down, and then work backwards to develop that idea and test that idea as you did with the user research. When you talk to people about your concept for something, use the documentation for the same process. Show that documentation to others and get their feedback and their ideas. And does this part make sense of the document? If not, what can we do to make it clearer? You can take this, you can do this with a narrative sketch, so a simple document shared that's like a purpose statement outlining what the thing will do, how it will work, why it should exist, what problem does it solve. This is a very fast way, it's low overhead for you to just spin up like a text sketch of your concept. You can also go with what Amazon does, which is create a mock press release. So this is a highly polished document that really is ready to be published by a newspaper. It's ready to be engaging with customers and really sell them on the features of the idea that you have. You have a byline and you give quotes from your users and the product creators or the project creators. It's really like quite polished, but it really is effective for thinking and communicating with that person that you hope will use the thing that you're building. And then there's also README-driven development, which is from Tom Preston Warner, one of the co-founders of GitHub, who suggests writing your README first. Some of the arguments around this is like, well, that sounds like waterfall, but the whole idea is that a README is a very brief file, that you're not going to be writing a whole spec from the outset and then like a whole long plan. You write a simple README file that captures what the narrative sketch might capture with like what the purpose of your project is, how it might work, who is the target audience, what problem does it solve. You sketch that very simply, and then you have it already. And then you can publish something on GitHub that has documentation ready-made. So the reasons for doing this are that it helps drive conversation around your ideas right away. It's also transparency because it gives you the platform for weaving in other people's feedback and insights into your development process from the beginning. And it's also great for onboarding. So even if I once had a dev on my team say like, oh, I don't want to write READMEs for internal repos because like that's just like marketing crap. Like who am I serving? And I said, well, you're serving your next colleague who joins this team and needs to sit down and figure out how all of this stuff works. That developer, by the way, is now promoting README-driven development as an option. So people can change and love to write docs in the end. So how do you actually document a piece of software in an effective way? So I kind of touched upon this with the narrative doc and the press release, having something that sells the idea to your potential customers. With the README, this is my favorite vehicle for doing that because every GitHub repo has the option to have a README file in it. And it's usually the front, it's like the storefront for our software. So here's a simple template that you can use, and you can find it at this link. If you follow this basic template, you're doing pretty well. You're answering probably 80% of the major questions that your peer on the other side of the world is going to be asking when they come and visit your repository. But having these essentials in place can make or break your project. And they also speak for you. You can't speak to that developer halfway around the world in person. Let your README do it for you. To help you along, I've actually created a README maturity model. So maybe this maturity model is a 5-level, step-by-step suggestion or guide for you to take a basic README and then add features to it that over time communicate more and more context to your potential users, your potential contributors, and even yourself. If you come back 6 months later, you'll still understand like what your project does and why you made certain decisions and all of that stuff. So it starts out at the level of the code is the documentation, which is one of my favorite sayings that I love to dispel and debunk and fight with. But it takes that level and then helps you kind of put meat on the bones of your README so that over time you can refine it. And you can find that at this repository. When you have documentation and users in place, then you can actually code collaboratively. And I mentioned InnerSource at the outset. So InnerSource is the open source collaboration model, but taken inside an organization. So it's really not different at all, except that the projects and the code that you're working on won't be shared outside of your company, whether it's because of audit and compliance reasons or very sensitive data, all kinds of reasons. It's just not useful to the rest of the world because it's too coupled to your own systems. You can apply the InnerSource model to drive communication and collaboration and hopefully reduce duplication and redundancies, which is a common problem in bigger organizations. You can also help unblock one team who's waiting on another team to make a fix. So in a typical InnerSource negotiation, there's a team that owns a service or repo, library, whatever. Team B comes along and says, hey, we need a change to that. They work it out through dialogue, negotiation, making sure that everybody's clear on what the change will be and if it's necessary and that it won't break something. And then they go and they do it. And then Team B doesn't wait on Team A, the owning team, for the change. Team A is fine. They're not freaked out. Like, what did Team B do to our stuff? And everybody ideally is happy. And this works best when you have those open values that I mentioned earlier. You have the transparency. You can't have like private repositories in GitHub Enterprise and do this because no one will find your repos. You have to have a collaborative and communicative mindset to be willing to have those negotiations or find someone on your team to have them. And you have to prioritize those kinds of negotiations so that you don't waste your time spent making a pull request that's only going to be rejected by the owning team because it's so outside of scope and would break everything. So talking drives InnerSource, and InnerSource drives talking. And Zalando saw this happen. We have lots of examples and evidence around this. Last summer, we did a pilot program with InnerSource with 25 teams that were willing to participate. And we had some really great outcomes. So Skipper is an HTTP router that we have open source. It turned into a Kubernetes ingress because a team in the fashion store or the customer-facing website talked to a team in the platform infra world or department. They got together and they made great things happen just by communicating. We had one team finish a project in 1/3 of the time because instead of having a product specialist or product manager orchestrate all of this complex administrative overhead, the team just talked to each other in person, worked things out, and a 3-month project became a 1-month project. And it was quite important for the business, so they felt quite good about that. We've also seen where we had 10 OAuth2 JSON JavaScript client libraries become fewer than 10. I'm actually not sure of the current number, but we had 10 versions of basically the same thing because of that duplication that you get in a big organization. We have one person say, hey, we don't need 10 of this, like let's just have one. And so that person is communicating to all of the teams to try to just make that happen and have a single library for all teams and all use cases. Here's an example from my colleagues' comments, just using the simple comments function. This goes a lot better, once again, when you have those open values of transparency, inclusivity, collaboration, because what happens from those values is that your level of trust among developers goes up. And communication takes a lot less time, there's a lot less friction, there's a lot less emotion. So here is a case where one team needed to make a fix on a credentials provider. The owning team didn't have the time to do it themselves, so Team B came along, made the fix. Everybody's happy. And this saved a lot of time for lots of other teams around them. This was a pervasive problem that they fixed, and all it was just using simple GitHub comments because they had a pretty high level of trust with each other. So with that team, I want to show you 2 examples of their work 2 years ago, and then currently, the current project they're working on, to show you how much of a difference communication can make. So remember, this is the same team making these things. So when this team didn't communicate as much, wasn't as transparent and collaborative, they came up with stuff like this. So this was an open source collection of tools and components, went on GitHub, and it's basically a wrapper around AWS with Docker deployment capabilities. So there's a Docker registry. There's auditing and compliance aspects of this to make sure that we are compliant. Because what this all was trying to achieve and has done successfully is enable autonomous teams to have their own AWS accounts without running afoul of compliance guidelines. So if you didn't know Zalando, and most people didn't, like in North America, like I didn't know what it was before I got there. If we're sending this to you and like, hey, there's our open source project, go and use it. Like you don't know what to expect. You don't know if you should trust us. If you don't know what the quality of the craftsmanship is. You don't know if it works. You don't know if it's useful. But this was kind of the message we were sending out there. Is like, okay, go ahead and use it. Nobody really did. We used it. It has been quite useful and successful for us. A year after we released it, we did a survey of the team, and 90% of about 210 respondents said, this is great. Please keep it. But I often don't know what a lot of this stuff does because the documentation is outdated or it's incomplete. It's so complex, I don't know how all of it works, or I have to really fight to get it to work. A lot of complaints were about the names. So the names are actually Zalando private labels, clothing, and so they don't really tell you what these components do. So you might, what is a berry? What is a your turn? What are these things saying? So the communication between this project and its users was pretty choppy. But again, it's still something that has worked for us and kept us in compliance. And we've been, after you get it all set up, it works beautifully. Now, what if we had actually made this and communicated more and communicated differently as we made it? What if we had provided a simpler message with the project itself? What if we had done user research, created some personas for future users, and gotten that feedback that we sought a year later, much earlier, like in the early stages of development? What if we had InnerSourced this instead of having a small team of very busy people spin this up? What if we had added contribution guidelines? So, all of these things weren't present. The team itself was working on about 5 major projects at the same time, so they did as well as they could. But they just didn't have the time and the people resources and also the context to really drive communication to leverage them. Now, again, the same team 2 years later has made a really successful project by communicating. And it's called External DNS. So it's on the Kubernetes incubator. You can go and see Lachlan Evanson's demo on YouTube. It's also linked here. He's a happy user of External DNS. He calls it the last bit of glue for setting up your ingress and deploying services and actually putting them in the DNS. So it's not like Kubernetes DNS, but it's inspired by it. It makes your resources discoverable by public DNS servers. When the team started creating this idea, they started with an internal concept. So it was called Mate, and it was very specific to our needs. But then, very early on, they started reaching out to Google groups and reaching out to Kubernetes core developers and the community at large and talking to folks at KubeCon and presenting this idea to those people. And here is the actual moment where in the GitHub comments, the folks from the community say, yes, this is a great idea. Like, we should develop this together. And so by reaching out to those core developers in that community, my colleagues on the team had a great opportunity to develop something for the entire Kubernetes community instead of just our own internal community. And so they've been doing a lot of great work that's involving communicating. So writing docs, having a code of conduct to let people know that they'll be treated well, having contributor guidelines, having a license file that spells out very clearly how others can use the project. And then they've continued talking about it in different presentations and in blog posts. So this is an example of the same people in a lot of cases. This core team is the same, but just changing the context has gotten them much different results from that big complex beast we saw a couple slides before. So as they continue working on external DNS, they keep talking, keep reaching out to new audiences. They keep collecting feedback from each other and then also from the greater community at large. And this is helping them to really drive the project's success. So this is an essential step that you need to take once you actually have created something. So now we'll just talk about a few reminders and I'll give a few tips about what you can do to keep talking to your audience, to keep making your code successful. So in a couple of examples more from Zalando, here, these are two projects that are relevant for Docker users that have shown really high levels of communication with their audiences. And as a result, they have dozens of contributors, they have millions of users in the Selenium's case. These projects were built for other people. And the maintainers really visualized other people in mind when they started working. They thought of peers halfway around the world that were in the same position and needed the same things as they did. And they stayed in touch with those peers around the world and kept speaking and developing and reaching out to them. And as a result, their projects continue to grow. So Patroni, just quickly, is a high availability, it's a template for high availability Postgres. It's highly customizable. It solves a really difficult database problem. And people at Red Hat are kind of collaborating. Josh Berkus at Red Hat is one of our contributors. So he also is using it inside Red Hat for other purposes. We're using it as well. Selenium allows you to have a disposable, flexible Docker-based Selenium grid infrastructure. And with this case, the team was, making this as easy as possible for users, creating a simple script to run, having a video recording and dashboards showing people, exactly what to expect and how to work with it. And they regularly ask the community for feedback on new features. So they often give talks on this at conferences, and then as part of that, they collect the feedback and integrate it back into the project. Here's an example that's not super relevant for this audience, but it's a data set created by our research lab. So this is an example of taking user research that was kind of organically coming up on Twitter a few months ago and creating a project that served the needs of people that were expressing that need. So MNIST is a data set that's been around for quite a long time, I think since the late 90s. And people on Twitter were complaining that it was overused. It wasn't, we needed a new solution for the times. And so my colleagues in the Zalando Research Lab, who are data scientists, created a brand new data set. These images are shirts and shoes from our data. And so this data set has about 60,000 images. And then there's a separate side project that has 10,000 images, and you can play with this yourselves. The actual MNIST author has given, positive praise for this. He was quite happy to see that someone came around and developed part 2 or the second version, the sequel of his original work. But again, this was coming from listening to what people needed, taking that feedback, and it was just existing ambiently in the environment of Twitter, and capitalizing on it and providing a solution for many people. So, in that case, with these projects that I've just shown you, the maintainers are really dedicated to being friendly and welcoming and integrating feedback from others. And so they're, this doesn't require user research to realize that people want you to be nice to them and being warm and friendly. Saying thanks promptly to anybody who is filing an issue, especially if they're filing a pull request, these small gestures might not feel like a big deal, but they might make the difference between a person sticking around with your project and helping you grow it and abandoning it forever because they never heard from you. Having a code of conduct is helpful, again, by putting people on notice that they can expect a good treatment when they start getting involved. And I'm just going to say it again, like responding promptly to any kind of query from the community or from, if it's your internal community, from a different team, will make you like so popular with them because, you're responding, you care, you're listening, you're giving an answer, you're helping them get something done faster. They're not waiting on you. You're having a dialogue. Docker did this. So, a few months ago, I was on a Twitter thread, and Jerome Pedizzani and Solomon Hykes, and all these great Docker people were jumping in on it, because I'd asked them, how did you grow Docker? And there was a nice conversation that came out of this question, and some of the quotes are here. So that when the early days of Docker, they really valued the contributors. Sometimes it felt like more maybe than the maintaining team, but they really put contributors first. And possibly this was because of experiences with other projects that didn't do that and might have been rougher, harder, more hostile or unfriendly. They onboarded newbies really closely, so really helping people get adjusted into the workflows and talking to them and making them feel comfortable, welcome, and valued. And sometimes if a new person wasn't able to do the preferred thing right away, instead of making them go back and forth for a long discussion online, a maintainer might take a pull request over just to make sure that it gets through the finish line. And that can reduce friction and also make sure that the work is taken advantage of in a good way. And the person who's contributing sees, that they were making a difference in a project that they like. So all of these tricks and tips don't require anything, except a little bit of time, but the payoff can be huge. Just a few words can really make a difference for someone. When you have a community of users, that gives you your focus group. Your focus group may be several dozen people, or it could be really large. Keep poking back with that Jen Meow Meow user in the earlier part of the talk. Like, see if they're still having a good experience using your work. Maybe if you have the opportunity to sit down with them, do a contextual interview. So actually sit at their workstation, watch how they interact with your project, see if they have any pauses, see if they have to ask someone for help, see if they're making a puzzled look. Pay attention to that data, because that data is telling you that you need to change something, most likely. You need to make it simpler. You need to simplify your message and your project's message so that that person can, engage without so much effort. And it's more like a free-flowing dialogue with your software instead of a fight. Collect testimonials from users. Not only does this help you, you can stick these in your README, and it helps other developers see exactly okay, this project works. Here's a separate company, and they had a great experience with using this. So that's really helpful for you, but it also helps your users feel rewarded and listened to. And again, you can do surveys in a pinch, but you won't collect the same amount of data. It might not have as much texture as a one-on-one, definitely not a contextual interview, or even a user testimonial where you're allowing somebody to describe their experience with your work in a longer format. All of this work but pays off. Again, it can be really simple. It almost never costs anything to do because it's all our technology for this is in ourselves. So we can just, speak and write and yes, it takes time and time is money, but still there's no additional plugins or extensions that we have to, use to do any of this stuff. And the payoffs are often, greater engagement of your users, even contributors. Sometimes they will become contributors. Goodwill, you're a good citizen of the community that you're working in. Perspective, as you listen to people and get their insights, you get to understand, other realities, and that can help you build stronger products for more people. It helps you get opportunities. If you have a great project, maybe somebody wants to pay you to turn it into a business. And finally, friendships, because these are really important. Friendships drive us, motivate us, make us happy, and working on something really cool is often a great way to establish friendships because you're united around a common theme or purpose, and that very context can really bring collaboration, closeness, and all kinds of positive benefits from that. And anybody can do this well. Again, whether you're shy, you don't like public speaking, you don't write well, or you don't enjoy it, it doesn't matter. There's a way of communicating for all of us that feels right for us. So, figure out what that is and then just keep going with it. Maybe the other formats will follow, and then you'll be a communication wizard. And I'll close on this tweet again from Andrea Goulet, who I mentioned earlier, who said that empathy is a skill. Instead of making lots of stuff all the time, maybe we should mend what we've already created, because our infrastructure of software is so big and always growing. But maybe we don't need to build our own thing every time. Maybe we need to fix what's there, make the apps more stable, make them higher quality. And that all requires collaboration and communication for that to actually take place and for it to work. So, but it's a nice alternative to, developing in a silo. So thanks. I didn't...